The harsh blue light of the smartphone screen pierced the darkness of their master bedroom at 2:14 a.m. Michael sat on the edge of the mattress, listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of his wife, Harper, who slept peacefully just inches away. To the outside world, they were the golden couple of Silicon Valley, co-founders of Pemberton Tech, untouchable, brilliant, and deeply in love. But as Michael's thumb scrolled through the hidden, encrypted chat logs he had just unlocked, the illusion shattered into jagged pieces. He doesn't suspect a thing. The transfer is complete. See you at the hotel. The message was from a contact saved simply as N. A sickening knot formed in Michael's stomach. The betrayal was right there in black and white, but a subtle, terrifying feeling crept over him. This was only the surface of a much darker abyss. If stories of fractured trust, hidden motives, and the devastating price of betrayal in the modern world speak to you, stay with me. Let's uncover the truth in the shadows. The rain in San Francisco rarely falls with any real conviction. It usually just hangs in the air, a persistent, damp mist that clings to the glass and steel of the city. But tonight, it was pouring. The heavy drops lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the master bedroom at the Meridian, casting distorted liquid shadows across the expansive floor. It was 2:14 a.m. Michael Sullivan sat perfectly still on the edge of the California king bed. The room was submerged in darkness, save for the harsh, artificial blue glow illuminating his face. In his right hand, he held a sleek, silver smartphone. Not his own. Just inches behind him, Harper was asleep. Her breathing was a steady, rhythmic metronome, a sound that had anchored Michael for the past 7 years. Her blonde hair spilled over the silk pillowcase, capturing the faint ambient light from the city below. She looked serene, untouchable, the brilliant, fierce co-founder of Pemberton Tech, reduced to a portrait of innocent slumber. Michael's thumb hovered over the screen, trembling slightly. His heart hammered a violent rhythm against his ribs, a sickening counterbeat to his wife's peaceful breathing. It had started with a simple, stupid anomaly. Harper had left her phone on the marble bathroom counter while she took a shower. Michael had gone in to grab his toothbrush when the screen lit up. There was no banner, no name, just a blank notification from an app whose icon looked exactly like the standard iOS calculator. He wouldn't have thought twice about it, except for the fact that Harper was a mathematician by trade. She did complex algorithms in her head and despised basic calculator apps. She had deleted the native one years ago. Curiosity, that fatal human flaw, had driven him to pick it up. A 6-digit passcode. He tried her birthday. Incorrect. He tried their anniversary. Incorrect. He tried the date Pemberton Tech went public. The screen unlocked. It wasn't a calculator. The interface shifted instantly from a numeric keypad to a sleek, dark mode messaging platform. No pictures, no avatars, just lines of stark white text against a black background. Michael swallowed hard, his throat dry as ash. He scrolled upward, the blue light reflecting in his wide, unblinking eyes. N. Room 412 at the Archer. Thursday, I'll leave the key at the desk under your maiden name, Harper. I'll be there by 8. Michael thinks I have a board prep meeting. I can only stay until midnight. N. Midnight is enough. Wear the black dress. Harper. Only for you. A physical wave of nausea washed over Michael. He pressed his left hand over his mouth to muffle the sharp, ragged gasp that tore from his lungs. The words blurred as moisture gathered in his eyes, but he forced himself to blink it away. He had to read. He had to know. He scrolled back further. Weeks, months. A digital archive of his own destruction, meticulously documented in timestamps and encrypted data packets. They weren't just discussing sex. They were discussing logistics, alibis, and the careful orchestration of a double life. Michael slowly turned his head to look at his wife over his shoulder. The woman who had sworn to him, the woman who had built an empire by his side, the woman who had kissed him goodbye that very morning with a soft smile and a promise to be home early. He looked back at the screen. The most recent message, the one that had triggered the blank notification, was sent just 20 minutes ago, while he had been asleep. N. He doesn't suspect a thing. The transfer is complete. See you at the hotel. Michael froze. The transfer is complete. The phrase struck a discordant note in his mind. It didn't fit the syntax of two clandestine lovers. It was clinical, transactional. The cold dread pooling in his stomach suddenly shifted, evolving from the agonizing pain of a betrayed husband into the sharp, hyper-alert paranoia of a CEO. He locked the phone, setting it exactly where he had found it on her nightstand, matching the angle precisely. He stood up, his bare feet silent on the plush carpet, and walked toward the rain-streaked window, looking out over the glittering, ruthless expanse of Silicon Valley. His marriage was over. He knew that now. But as he stared into the dark city, a terrifying realization began to take root in his mind. Harper was definitely sleeping with another man. But why did he feel like he was the one being robbed? The morning sun broke through the lingering San Francisco fog, casting long, pale, and unforgiving angles across the minimalist kitchen of their penthouse. It was a Tuesday. Ordinarily, Michael would already be scanning the pre-market tech valuations while sipping a perfectly pulled espresso. Today, the bitter dark roast tasted like battery acid on his tongue. He sat at the quartz island, holding his tablet, though his eyes hadn't registered a single word on the screen for the past 20 minutes. He was waiting for her. Harper emerged from the master suite, the rhythmic click of her designer heels echoing against the hardwood floor. She was dressed in a tailored charcoal blazer and a crisp silk blouse, the armor of a Silicon Valley executive. She moved with a practiced, elegant efficiency, pausing by the mirror near the foyer to adjust a diamond stud in her ear. Michael watched her from over the rim of his coffee cup. He searched her face for a tremor, a shadow of guilt, any microscopic crack in the pristine facade she presented to the world. There was nothing. She looked exactly as she had yesterday and the day before that. The realization hit him with a heavy physical ache. How long had she been perfecting this performance? His mind involuntarily drifted back to a cramped, unventilated garage in Palo Alto 7 years ago. The air had smelled of ozone, burnt solder, and cheap takeout. They had been surviving on 4 hours of sleep and instant coffee, fueled entirely by the manic, intoxicating belief that the compression algorithm they were building would change the world. He remembered Harper sitting cross-legged on a thrift store sofa, her blonde hair tied up in a messy knot, a smudge of dry erase marker across her cheek. She had looked up from her laptop, her eyes burning with a fierce, brilliant light, and said, "We've got it, Michael. We actually cracked it." He had kissed her then. It was a kiss that tasted of exhaustion and triumph, a collision of two people who were entirely, unequivocally on the same team. They had nothing back then except Pemberton Tech and each other. Now they had everything: the penthouse, the venture capital, the magazine covers, and they had absolutely nothing at all. "Morning," Harper said, her voice smooth and melodic as she poured herself a cup of black coffee. She didn't look at him, her attention already shifting to the smartwatch on her wrist. "Morning," Michael replied. It took a monumental act of willpower to keep his voice steady, to prevent the word from cracking under the weight of the betrayal festering inside him. "Sleep well?" "Like a rock," she murmured, taking a brief sip. "Listen, I'm going to be slammed today. The integration team is pushing back on the new interface, and I have that board prep meeting tonight. I probably won't be back until after midnight." The words landed like physical blows. "I have that board prep meeting. I can only stay until midnight." It was the exact alibi she had typed to the contact in just hours ago. Michael lowered his tablet, forcing the corners of his mouth into a supportive, understanding smile. It felt grotesque, like stretching a rubber mask over his skull. "Don't burn yourself out, Harper. The board knows the value of your code. Take a breather if you need it." "You know I can't do that," she replied, finally meeting his gaze. For a fraction of a second, looking into her clear, unwavering blue eyes, Michael almost doubted what he had seen in the dark. She looked so earnest, so committed. She set her mug down, leaned over the counter, and pressed a brief, perfunctory kiss to his cheek. It was a ghost of a touch, leaving behind the faint, expensive scent of her perfume. "I'll see you tomorrow. Love you." "Love you too," Michael said to the empty air as the heavy oak door clicked shut behind her. The silence of the penthouse rushed back in, suffocating and absolute. The game had officially begun, and Michael knew that if he played his hand too soon, he would lose far more than just his wife. The executive suite of Pemberton Tech was a fortress of soundproof glass and brushed steel, suspended 40 stories above the bustling streets of San Francisco. It was designed to project absolute control. But as Michael locked the heavy oak door and lowered the motorized privacy blinds, he felt entirely powerless. He sank into his ergonomic leather chair and woke his private desktop. He bypassed the standard corporate network, routing his connection through a shadow server he had secretly maintained since the company's inception. Michael was a CEO now, a man of tailored suits and shareholder meetings, but a decade ago, he had been one of the most ruthless systems architects in the Valley. He still knew how to hunt in the dark. He typed the 10-digit number he had burned into his memory from Harper's hidden app. As expected, it was a ghost number, a VoIP line shielded by multiple layers of encryption, a dead end for a private investigator, but not for him. Michael ran a packet sniffing script, searching for the microsecond handshake leak that occurred when the message was delivered to the local cell tower at 2:14 a.m. For 45 agonizing minutes, lines of code cascaded down his monitor like falling ash. His mind tormented him with fragmented images of Harper. He pictured her in the black dress she had mentioned. He imagined her leaning across a dimly lit table, whispering secrets into the ear of a faceless phantom. The sheer, primal sting of physical jealousy tightened his chest, making it difficult to draw a full breath. Was it the excitement she craved? Had their marriage become too predictable, too consumed by quarterly earnings and press releases? Then the script hit a terminal node. The ping traced back to a VPN, which tethered to a static IP address registered to a shell corporation in Delaware. Michael's fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, tearing down the corporate veil with practiced aggression. The shell company leased dedicated server racks. The billing address for those racks belonged to Vanguard Dynamics. Michael's hand stopped moving. The rhythmic clacking of the keyboard was replaced by a deafening silence. Vanguard Dynamics. The Phantom and had a name. Noah Taylor. Noah was the founder and CEO of Vanguard, Pemberton Tech's most aggressive, well-funded rival. He was everything the media loved: 34, charismatic, relentlessly ambitious, and famously single. Only last month Noah had smiled from the cover of a major business magazine, his sharp jawline and predatory gaze practically daring the rest of the industry to keep up. A fresh, suffocating wave of inadequacy washed over Michael. He stared at his own reflection in the dark bezel of the monitor. He saw the subtle graying at his temples, the faint lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. He was 41, aged prematurely by the grueling marathon of building an empire. Noah was fresh. Noah was a conqueror. He imagined Harper's hands tracing Noah's shoulders in room 412 of the Archer Hotel. The thought was a physical poison, burning through his veins. He wanted to shatter the monitor. He wanted to drive to Vanguard Dynamics and drag Noah out by his collar in front of his entire board of directors. But as the initial blinding rage began to subside, the cold, calculating architecture of Michael's brain reasserted itself. Harper was brilliant. She calculated risk down to the decimal point. She despised recklessness. Having a passionate, messy affair with the CEO of their biggest competitor wasn't just risky, it was corporate suicide. It defied all her behavioral logic. Unless the affair wasn't the objective, the transfer is complete. The words echoed in the sterile silence of his office. The jealousy abruptly crystallized into a terrifying, icy focus. Noah Taylor wasn't just sleeping with his wife. He was dismantling his empire from the inside out, using the woman Michael loved as the ultimate Trojan horse. The mahogany desk in Mark's corner office felt less like a workspace and more like an autopsy table. At 8 p.m., the sprawling corridors of Kingsley and Partners were abandoned, leaving only the low ambient hum of the climate control system and the sharp clink of ice against crystal. Rain continued to lash against the reinforced glass, blurring the vibrant city lights into streaks of neon bleeding into the dark. Mark handed Michael a heavy tumbler of scotch. Between them, resting precisely in the center of the desk, sat a bound document, 50 pages of thick, watermarked paper. The prenuptial agreement. "I need to know exactly how sharp this blade is," Michael said, his voice stripped of all inflection. He stared at the document, refusing to touch it. Mark sighed, the sound heavy with the weariness of a man who had guided too many friends through this exact inferno. He sat heavily in his leather executive chair. "It's airtight, Michael. We drafted it right before Pemberton's Series B funding. You were paranoid about protecting the IP back then. Section 4, paragraph 2, the infidelity clause." Mark flipped the heavy pages until he found the earmark section, tapping it with a gold pen. "If she violates the marriage vows, she forfeits her right to any equity vested after the wedding date, and her spousal support is zeroed out. She walks away with her initial base shares, which are non-voting. If you trigger this, she effectively loses all control and influence over Pemberton Tech. She leaves with a fraction of her net worth." "I want to trigger it," Michael said, taking a slow, burning sip of the scotch. Mark stopped, his professional detachment faltering for a fraction of a second. "You're serious? I thought you two were the untouchable exception to the Valley's divorce rate." "We were. Now we aren't." Michael looked up, his eyes hollow and dark. "She's sleeping with Noah Taylor." Mark leaned back slowly, processing the magnitude of the name. Vanguard Dynamics. The silence in the room thickened, suddenly suffocating. "Jesus Christ, Mike. Noah, do you have proof? Because if we invoke Section 4 against someone like Harper, we are going to war. A bloody, public, scorched earth war. She will hire the best litigators on the West Coast to invalidate this document. I have chat logs from a hidden app on her phone. They meet at the Archer Hotel." Mark shook his head, a grim, apologetic look crossing his features. "Digital logs aren't enough, especially encrypted ones acquired without her consent. A skilled defense attorney will dismiss them as spoofed data or even fantasy roleplay. A judge might throw them out entirely as inadmissible. To enforce this prenup and strip her of her voting rights, you need a smoking gun. You need her caught in the act. Photographs, financial paper trails, or a recorded confession." Michael's gaze drifted back to the prenup. It was the physical manifestation of his marriage's conditional nature, a safety net he had hoped never to use, now transformed into a weapon of mass destruction. He hadn't told Mark about the phrase, "the transfer is complete." He couldn't. If word leaked that Pemberton's proprietary code might be compromised, the board would panic, the stock would plummet, and he would be ousted before he could even file for divorce. He had to contain the blast radius. "So I wait," Michael concluded quietly, the reality of his situation settling like lead in his stomach. "You wait," Mark confirmed, his tone sympathetic but firm. "We hire a private investigator. We get time-stamped photographs of them entering and leaving that hotel room. We build an impenetrable wall of evidence. But Michael, listen to me carefully. Until the trap snaps shut, you have to play the devoted husband. If she smells blood, she will move her assets, rally the board against you, and paint you as the paranoid, abusive spouse." Michael closed his eyes. Exhaustion, cold and absolute, seeped deep into his bones. Playing the devoted husband meant smiling at her over morning coffee. It meant listening to her talk about their future. It meant sharing a bed with a woman who was actively engineering his ruin. "I can do that," Michael lied. The Blue Moon Bar was a subterranean relic of old San Francisco, a place defined by crushed velvet, tarnished brass, and shadows so thick they felt physical. It was the kind of establishment where affairs were born and corporate empires were quietly divided over expensive bourbon. Michael sat invisible in a corner booth, shielded by a heavy oak pillar, an untouched glass of whiskey resting on the table before him. It was Thursday night, 8:15 p.m. According to her shared calendar, Harper was currently in a marathon prep session with the board of directors. But the GPS tracker Michael had discreetly slipped into the lining of her designer handbag that morning told a different story. He saw her before he saw him. Harper slid into a curved leather booth near the back of the room. She was wearing the black dress. It was a simple, devastating piece of silk they had bought together in Milan 3 years ago. A dress she had not worn for him since their 5th anniversary. The dim amber light from a table lamp caught the sharp angle of her jaw and the soft curve of her neck as she smiled at someone across the table. Then, Noah Taylor leaned into the frame. Seeing them together in the flesh was entirely different from reading lines of encrypted text on a screen. The digital logs had been a cold, clinical wound. This was a visceral, bleeding laceration. Noah was exactly as he appeared on magazine covers, effortlessly confident, radiating a predatory, polished charm. He reached across the small, round table, and his hand covered hers. Michael stopped breathing. He watched his wife's reaction, praying for a flinch, a moment of hesitation. There was none. Instead, Harper turned her palm upward, her fingers lacing smoothly through Noah's. She leaned forward, closing the distance between them, her eyes locked on his with an intensity that made Michael's stomach twist violently. It was a look of absolute, unguarded intimacy. It was the exact look she used to give Michael when they were young, hungry, and fighting the world together from that freezing Palo Alto garage. A sudden, roaring noise filled Michael's ears, drowning out the low jazz playing from the stage. His right hand gripped the edge of the heavy mahogany table so hard his knuckles turned bone white. The impulse to stand up, to cross the room and shatter the serene bubble of their betrayal, was almost overpowering. He wanted to flip the table. He wanted to see the smug confidence wipe from Noah's face. He wanted to see Harper look at him with the terror of a woman whose perfectly constructed world was collapsing. But Mark's warning echoed in the back of his mind like a physical restraint. If she smells blood, she will move her assets. Michael forced his lungs to expand, drawing in a shaky breath of air, thick with the scent of aged liquor and expensive perfume. He was a CEO. He had negotiated hostile takeovers and navigated federal audits. He could not lose control over a broken heart. He forced himself to watch them for another 40 minutes. He endured the sight of Noah leaning in to whisper something that made Harper throw her head back in genuine, uninhibited laughter. He watched them finish their drinks. He watched Noah stand, casually placing a proprietary hand on the small of Harper's back as he guided her toward the rear exit, toward the adjoining lobby of the Archer Hotel. Michael remained frozen in his booth long after they had vanished into the shadows. The physical affair was confirmed. The visual evidence was burned into his retinas permanently. But as he finally picked up his warm whiskey and took a burning swallow, the calculating architecture of his brain began to overtake the grief. They were too careful. The touch, the laughter, it was perfect, almost flawlessly executed. He realized with a chill that went straight to his marrow that he wasn't just watching two lovers caught in a whirlwind romance. He was watching a transaction. The terrifying question remained, what exactly was his wife selling? 3 weeks bled into one another, transforming Michael's life into a grueling marathon of psychological endurance. The penthouse at the Meridian, once a sanctuary of shared ambition, had become a high-altitude prison. Every morning he poured the dark roast coffee. Every evening he asked about her day. And every night he lay rigidly on his side of the California king bed, listening to the steady, rhythmic breathing of a stranger. The hardest part was the physical proximity. Harper, oblivious to the fact that her husband was actively dissecting their marriage, maintained her usual cadence of casual affection. A brush of her hand against his shoulder as she walked past the quartz kitchen island, a light kiss on his jaw before she left for the office. Each touch felt like a localized burn. Michael learned to mask his involuntary flinches with feigned exhaustion, burying himself deeper into his financial reports or citing the crushing pressure of the upcoming quarterly earnings call. Behind the closed, soundproof doors of his executive suite at Pemberton Tech, however, Michael was not a victim. He was an architect, carefully constructing a guillotine. He had retained a private investigator named Vance, a ghost of a man with zero digital footprint and a terrifying talent for invisibility. Twice a week, Vance would bypass the corporate reception desk and deliver a thick, unmarked manila folder directly to Michael's private secure drop. Spilling the contents onto his mahogany desk late one Tuesday evening, Michael stared at the granular anatomy of his wife's betrayal. There were high-resolution photographs of Harper and Noah entering the underground parking garage of the Archer Hotel. There were time-stamped logs of their dinner reservations at discreet restaurants in Palo Alto, always paid for in cash. There was even a brief, damning video clip of them standing in the shadows of a secluded valet stand, Noah's hand resting intimately on the nape of her neck. It was enough to trigger the infidelity clause. It was enough to initiate the scorched earth divorce Mark had prepared. But Michael didn't pick up the phone to call his lawyer. He just stared at the timeline Vance had compiled, a deep, unsettling dissonance ringing in his ears. He opened his secure terminal and aligned the dates of the hotel rendezvous with Pemberton Tech's internal project management calendar. The first Tuesday they met at the Archer coincided perfectly with the finalization of the beta code for Pemberton's new compression protocol. The Thursday dinner at the Blue Moon Bar happened exactly 4 hours after an emergency board meeting discussing Vanguard Dynamics' sudden, unexplained surge in the market. The pattern was too precise, the correlation too aggressive to be a mere coincidence. Harper was a creature of absolute ruthless efficiency. She did not compartmentalize poorly. If she was risking a billion-dollar empire for a clandestine romance, she wouldn't schedule her illicit hotel stays immediately following highly classified engineering sprints. She would separate the risks. Unless, of course, the proximity wasn't an accident. Michael sat back in the dim light of his office, the photographs scattered before him like pieces of a horrifying puzzle. The blinding, visceral jealousy that had nearly suffocated him 3 weeks ago had completely burned away, leaving behind a cold, absolute clarity. Noah Taylor wasn't a lover swept up in an uncontrollable passion. He was a handler. The realization sent a violent shudder down Michael's spine, a chill that had nothing to do with the San Francisco fog rolling against his windows. He wasn't just building a case for a family court judge. He was preparing to amputate a lethal infection from his company. The foundation of his evidence was set. The trap needed to be perfect, and the agonizing period of waiting was finally over. The trap required absolute sociopathic precision. Michael zipped his leather overnight bag, the harsh sound slicing through the quiet hum of their Thursday morning routine. The penthouse smelled of fresh espresso and the expensive, subtle floral notes of Harper's perfume. "Seattle weather looks miserable," Michael remarked smoothly, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt in the hallway mirror. He didn't look at her directly, focusing instead on the reflection of her standing by the kitchen island. Harper was scrolling through her tablet, a pristine vision in a tailored white sheath dress. "It's only 2 days, Michael. Just smile, shake hands with the venture capitalists, and secure the server deal. You'll be back before you know it." She walked over, her heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood, and adjusted his tie. It was a gesture of such practiced domestic intimacy that it nearly made him physically ill. "I'll be at the office until at least 1 in the morning," she added, perfectly setting her own alibi. "The data migration protocol is a nightmare, and the engineering team is practically in revolt. I might just sleep in the lounge." "Don't kill yourself over it," Michael replied, his voice a steady, calm baritone. He leaned down and kissed her cheek. It felt like pressing his lips against cold marble. "I'll call you from the hotel." Michael took the private elevator down to the lobby, climbed into the waiting black town car, and instructed the driver to head towards San Francisco International. But 20 minutes down the highway, he handed the driver a thick stack of $100 bills. "Change of plans, circle back, drop me at the service alley behind the Meridian, and forget you drove me today." By 10:30 a.m., Michael was back inside his own penthouse, a ghost haunting his own life. He didn't turn on a single light. He closed the heavy motorized blackout shades, plunging the massive apartment into a deep, artificial twilight. Then he sat in the vintage Eames lounge chair in the far corner of the living room, a spot entirely swallowed by shadows facing the front entrance. And he waited. The hours stretched into an agonizing eternity, testing the absolute limits of his sanity. The silence of the empty penthouse was deafening, broken only by the occasional distant siren from the city below. He didn't eat. He didn't drink. He simply sat in the dark, his mind meticulously reviewing the chat logs, the photographs, and the terrifying correlation with Pemberton Tech's server access records. He was no longer a grieving husband. He was a predator waiting for the prey to step into the snare. Outside, the sun set, and the vibrant neon pulse of the city bled through the edges of the window shades. At 1:15 a.m., the subtle, mechanical whir of the private elevator echoed in the foyer. Michael's heart abruptly stopped, then hammered a violent, singular rhythm against his ribs. He remained perfectly still in the velvet darkness of his chair. The heavy oak door unlatched with a solid click. Harper stepped inside, the ambient light from the hallway briefly outlining her silhouette before the door swung shut, plunging the room back into darkness. She sighed, a heavy, exhausted sound, and dropped her keys onto the silver tray by the console table. She didn't smell like the sterile, recycled air of a server room. Even from across the expansive living room, Michael could smell the distinct, sharp scent of expensive hotel soap and a faint, lingering trace of a men's cologne that definitely wasn't his. Harper kicked off her heels, the sound muffled by the Persian rug, and reached blindly for the wall switch to illuminate the foyer. How was the data migration? Michael's voice cut through the darkness, cold, flat, and completely devoid of mercy. The sudden sound of Michael's voice in the pitch-black penthouse hit Harper like a physical strike. She violently flinched, her hand freezing midway to the light switch. The heavy, suffocating silence of the room rushed back in, broken only by her sudden, shallow intake of breath. Michael reached over and clicked on the vintage brass reading lamp next to his chair. The harsh, focused circle of yellow light illuminated the space between them, casting long, grotesque shadows against the walls. He was still wearing his tailored suit, sitting with the unnatural stillness of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "Michael?" Harper whispered, her voice trembling with a perfectly calibrated mix of confusion and relief. "What are you doing sitting in the dark? I thought you were in Seattle." "The server deal fell through," he lied smoothly, his voice devoid of any warmth. He didn't blink. "And you aren't wearing the perfume you put on this morning. You smell like Tom Ford. Noah Taylor's signature scent, if I'm not mistaken." The color drained from Harper's face so fast she looked like a porcelain doll under the dim light. The pristine, untouchable executive facade fractured, revealing a flicker of genuine, unadulterated panic. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, taking a half-step backward toward the heavy oak door. "I was at the office. The migration—" Michael didn't raise his voice. He simply reached into the leather folio resting on his lap and tossed a thick stack of printed papers onto the glass coffee table. The chat logs. They landed with a heavy, definitive thud. Following them were the glossy, high-resolution photographs Vance had taken. Harper and Noah entering the underground garage of the Archer Hotel, their hands intertwined, the undeniable proof of her betrayal. "Room 412, Michael stated coldly, leaning back in the Eames chair. "You wore the black dress, just like he asked." Harper stared at the photographs scattered across the glass. The silence in the penthouse stretched until it felt like the air itself was splintering. Then she executed her final, desperate maneuver. Her legs gave out. She collapsed to her knees on the Persian rug, letting out a sharp, agonizing sob that tore through the quiet room. She crawled toward him, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face, her hands desperately grasping at the fabric of his trousers. "Michael, please," she wailed, tears streaming down her cheeks, ruining her immaculate makeup. "Please, it's not what it looks like. It meant nothing. I was so lonely. You're always working. We never talk anymore. I made a mistake, a horrible, stupid mistake. I love you. Please don't throw us away." It was a masterful performance. If Michael hadn't spent the last 3 weeks cross-referencing her hotel stays with Pemberton Tech's server logs, he might have believed her. He might have reached down and held his broken wife. Instead, he felt absolutely nothing. He looked down at the woman sobbing at his feet, marveling at the sheer, terrifying depth of her deception. He calmly reached back into his folio and withdrew a thick, watermarked legal document. The finalized divorce petition, complete with the invoked infidelity clause from their prenuptial agreement. He dropped it onto the glass table next to the photos, followed by a heavy gold fountain pen. "Sign it," he commanded, his voice a lethal whisper. Harper stopped begging. She looked at the document, the stark reality of her financial ruin printed in black and white. Her chest heaved. Slowly, with trembling hands, she reached for the pen. She pulled the thick paper toward her, her tears falling freely now, hitting the page and blurring the dark ink of the signature line. She signed her name, a fractured, messy scrawl, weeping over the death of her marriage. Michael watched the tears stain the paper. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them, his face mere inches from hers. "I can forgive the nights you spend in his bed, Harper," he said softly, the words slicing through the quiet room like a scalpel. "But I can never forgive the days you spent in my boardroom." The echo of Michael's words hung in the suffocating darkness of the penthouse. "I can never forgive the days you spent in my boardroom." It was as if a physical switch had been flipped in the ambient temperature of the room. Harper's violent, theatrical sobs ceased instantly. The tears still glistened on her pale cheeks, and the dark ink on the divorce petition was still wet, but the trembling desperation vanished entirely. Slowly, she lifted her head from her hands. The devastated, heartbroken wife was gone. In her place sat the razor-sharp mathematician, her blue eyes calculating, cold and rapidly assessing the structural damage of her reality. Michael didn't move. He kept his gaze locked on hers, watching the exact moment the illusion shattered completely. The transition was terrifying to witness. "You always were an incredible actress, Harper," Michael said softly, leaning back into the deep shadows of the Eames chair. "For 3 weeks, I watched you play the victim in your own head. I watched you rehearse this exact moment, but you made one critical error. You thought my grief would blind my logic." Harper slowly pushed herself off the thick Persian rug, ignoring the signed papers resting on the glass table. She smoothed the front of her white sheath dress, her movements slow, mechanical, and deliberate. "What are you talking about, Michael?" she asked, her voice entirely stripped of its previous tremor. It was flat, defensive, and completely devoid of affection. "The timeline," Michael replied, picking up one of the printed chat logs. He didn't need to look at it. The dates and timestamps were permanently branded into his memory. "You claimed you were lonely. You claimed we drifted apart. If that were true, your meetings with Noah Taylor would have been erratic, driven by passion or convenience, or an emotional void. But they weren't. They were perfectly mathematically synced to our development cycle." He tossed the paper back onto the table. It slid across the glass, stopping near her trembling hand. "You met him on October 12th, the exact night we finalized the encryption keys for the new server protocol. You met him again on November 4th, mere hours after the emergency board meeting about Vanguard's sudden, unexplainable market share increase. Your affair wasn't a desperate romance, Harper. It was a scheduled data pipeline." Harper's jaw tightened. She took a step back, folding her arms tightly across her chest. A closed, defensive posture, completely abandoning the weeping surrender from moments ago. "You're paranoid. You've been sitting in the dark too long. You're trying to turn a personal marital failure into a grand corporate conspiracy because your massive ego can't handle the simple fact that I chose someone else over you." "My ego died the night I unlocked that fake calculator app on your phone," Michael countered, his voice dropping to a dangerous, steady calm that vibrated through the floorboards. "When I realized I wasn't enough for you, I grieved. But when I realized you were selling my company, I decided to do what I do best. I looked at the digital architecture." He reached into his leather folio one last time and pulled out a single, neatly folded sheet of technical printout. He didn't throw this one. He held it up, letting the dim brass light catch the lines of raw code. "I built the shadow backdoor into the Pemberton mainframe 7 years ago, back in the Palo Alto garage. I was paranoid about venture capitalists stealing our code. I never, in my darkest nightmares, thought I'd have to use it on my own wife. Yesterday, I accessed your secure terminal. I traced the outbound packet traffic." Harper stopped breathing. The faint, ambient neon light from the city outside caught the absolute, unadulterated terror suddenly pooling in her eyes. "Massive, heavily encrypted data packets," Michael continued mercilessly, driving the final nail into her coffin. "Routed through a proxy server and dumped directly into an IP address registered to a Vanguard Dynamics shell company. The exact minute of the data transfers matched the hours you were in room 412 at the Archer Hotel. You weren't just sleeping with him, Harper. You were handing him Pemberton tech, line by line." Harper stood frozen, the ambient neon light from the city below reflecting off the sheer panic in her wide, unblinking eyes. The silence in the penthouse was no longer the heavy, quiet tension of a failing marriage. It was the suffocating, terrifying vacuum of a collapsed empire. "You're insane," she whispered, though the violent tremor in her voice completely betrayed the lie. "You forged those server logs. You're trying to frame me to invalidate my equity under the prenup." Michael let out a short, hollow laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Frame you? Harper, you framed yourself. You thought you were so brilliant, using a classic, sordid affair as the perfect smokescreen. If you got caught, you'd just be another Silicon Valley cliche. A bored, neglected wife, a messy public divorce. The board would whisper, The tech blogs would gossip, but nobody would ever look at the source code. Because who audits a broken heart? He took a slow, deliberate step toward her, closing the distance until he could see the rapid, terrified pulse beating at the base of her throat. But I looked, Michael continued, his voice dropping to a lethal, quiet register that vibrated through the floorboards. And I didn't just find the outbound data packets, Harper. I dug deeper. I found the motive. I found the offshore accounts. Harper visibly flinched, taking a frantic step backward until her shoulders hit the cold glass of the floor-to-ceiling window. The rain outside continued to streak down the pane, mirroring the sudden, genuine tears welling in her eyes. Tears of pure, unadulterated terror. The crypto exchange, Michael stated, the words hanging in the air between them like a death sentence. The one that imploded 6 months ago. You leveraged your unvested Pemberton shares through a shadow proxy to cover a massive, illegal margin call on your personal investments. You were drowning in $40 million of toxic debt, and Noah Taylor found out. Didn't he? Harper pressed her hands flat against the glass behind her back, her breath fogging the cold pain. She looked like a trapped animal. The poised, untouchable mathematician, the ruthless executive, had been reduced to a cornered, desperate fraud in a tailored white dress. He bought your debt, Michael said, piecing the final, sickening puzzle together out loud. He owned you. The hotel rooms, the black dress, the fake romantic dinners. It wasn't a passionate love affair. It was a hostage exchange. You paid down your debt with my life's work, handing him our compression algorithm, packet by encrypted packet. A ragged, ugly sob tore from Harper's throat. It wasn't the theatrical, manipulative crying from 10 minutes ago. This was the visceral, hyperventilating sound of a woman watching the iron bars of a federal penitentiary close around her. Michael, he was going to destroy me, she choked out, sliding down the wet glass until she was sitting on the hardwood floor, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. He was going to expose the illegal leverage to the board. The SEC would have stripped me of everything. I would have faced 10 years in federal prison. I had no choice. You had a husband, Michael roared, the sudden explosion of volume startling even him. The cold, calculated CEO facade cracked for a fraction of a second, revealing the agonizing, bleeding core of the man beneath. You had me. We built this together in a freezing garage on instant coffee and a dream. You could have come to me. We could have fought him. We could have paid the damn debt, taken the public hit, and survived. He stood over her, his chest heaving, staring down at the trembling woman who had traded their shared soul for a secret. But you didn't, Michael whispered, the brief fire instantly dying out, replaced by a chilling, absolute zero. You chose to sell me out instead. You chose the Archer Hotel. Harper remained on the floor, her tailored white dress pooling around her like a surrendered flag against the dark hardwood. The sound of the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows filled the expansive silence of the penthouse, underscoring the absolute wreckage of her life. She looked up at Michael, expecting to see rage, or perhaps the lingering ghost of the man who had loved her. Instead, she saw a sovereign who had just won a war she didn't even know they were fighting. Michael turned away from her, walking back to the glass coffee table. He picked up his leather folio and withdrew a final item, a sleek, black flash drive, placing it carefully next to the tear-stained divorce petition. Did you honestly believe, Michael began, his voice a low, melodic hum of pure, concentrated authority, that I built a billion-dollar data empire without monitoring every single kilobyte that leaves my servers? Harper stopped trembling. The mathematician inside her, the brilliant architect of logic, suddenly recognized the fatal flaw in her own equation. A sickening wave of dread washed over her, far colder than the fear of federal prison. What did you do, Michael? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm outside. On November 5th, Michael answered, not looking at her, but staring down at the flash drive. The morning after your second hotel rendezvous with Noah, I didn't sever your backdoor access. I didn't lock you out of the mainframe. That would have tipped you off. Instead, I rerouted your shadow proxy through an isolated sandbox environment. Harper's breath hitched. She pushed herself up slightly, her hands gripping the edge of the sofa behind her for support. You altered the data packets. I poisoned them, Michael corrected, finally turning his gaze back to her. The look in his eyes was lethal, devoid of any mercy. The compression algorithm you spent the last 2 months feeding to Vanguard Dynamics? It isn't our master code. It's a synthetic replica. I introduced a deeply embedded, cascading memory leak into the architecture. A very specific, highly aggressive logic bomb. Harper's mind raced, visualizing the code she had stolen, the thousands of lines of syntax she thought she had verified. She knew exactly what a cascading memory leak of that magnitude would do. When they deploy it, she started, her voice breaking. When Vanguard integrates that code into their flagship operating system next week, Michael finished for her, his tone clinical and detached. It won't just fail. It will systematically brick their entire server ecosystem. It will corrupt their client databases. And when their forensic team inevitably tries to isolate the collapse, the digital footprint will explicitly, undeniably prove they integrated stolen proprietary assets from Pemberton Tech. Harper stared at the man standing before her. He wasn't the broken, neglected husband she had manipulated. He was an apex predator, and she had willingly walked into his jaws, dragging her blackmailer in with her. "You didn't just let me steal it," Harper breathed, a horrified realization dawning on her. "You used me as a courier to plant a bomb inside Vanguard. Noah Taylor wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate espionage using my wife," Michael said, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt with chilling composure. "I just changed the rules. Noah's finished. The SEC will freeze his assets by Tuesday. His board will execute him by Friday. And you, Harper, are entirely useless to him now." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a second legal document, dropping it onto the glass table. It was thicker than the divorce petition. "Corporate surrender," Michael stated. "You will resign from the board of directors, effective immediately. You will relinquish all voting rights, all equity vested after our wedding date, and every single patent you hold under the Pemberton umbrella. You walk away with your base non-voting shares, which will barely cover your legal fees when the crypto exchange bankruptcy goes to trial." Harper looked at the documents. The magnitude of her loss was absolute. "And if I refuse? Then I hand this flash drive to the FBI Cybercrimes Division in the morning," Michael replied smoothly. "And you spend the next 10 years in a federal penitentiary reflecting on the cost of room 412 at the Archer Hotel." The following Tuesday morning was painted in the same dreary, relentless San Francisco gray. The executive boardroom of Pemberton Tech, a sprawling expanse of glass, brushed steel and polished mahogany, felt more like a high-altitude mausoleum than a place of business. Mark sat at the head of the massive table, organizing thick stacks of legal documents with clinical, silent efficiency. Across from him sat Harper. She was wearing a simple, understated gray trench coat, her blonde hair pulled back tightly into a severe knot. The radiant, untouchable co-founder was gone. In her place sat a hollowed-out shell of a woman, bracing for the absolute destruction of her legacy. Michael stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the crawling traffic of the city. His phone buzzed continuously with breaking news alerts. Vanguard Dynamics was in freefall. Their flagship servers had crashed globally at 4 a.m., bricked by an aggressive, untraceable memory leak. The tech world was in a state of absolute panic, but the forensic trail was already being laid bare by anonymous whistleblowers Michael had carefully orchestrated over the weekend. Noah Taylor's empire was burning to the ground, exactly as planned. Michael turned away from the glass and took his seat opposite Harper. He didn't feel the intoxicating rush of victory he used to feel after a successful product launch. He only felt a deep, cavernous exhaustion seeping into his bones. "These are the final divestment forms, Harper," Mark said, his voice gentle but maintaining a strict professional distance. He slid the corporate surrender documents in the formalized, notarized divorce decree across the polished wood. "Once these are signed, your resignation is public. Your voting shares are nullified, and your access to the Pemberton campus is permanently revoked. The SEC will be notified of your personal financial restructuring. It will keep you out of federal prison, but you forfeit everything you built here." Harper stared blankly at the papers. Her hands, usually so steady when coding complex algorithms, trembled violently as she picked up the heavy gold fountain pen Mark offered. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sharp, agonizing scratch of the nib against the thick, watermarked paper. She signed her name. Once, twice, 3 times. With each signature, a piece of the life they had forged in that freezing Palo Alto garage was surgically severed. On the final page, the absolute dissolution of their marriage. She paused. The facade finally broke. A single heavy tear escaped her red-rimmed eyes, dropping straight down. It landed squarely on the signature line, blurring the dark blue ink of her name into a messy, illegible stain. She didn't wipe her face. She just pushed the documents back across the table, the pen clattering softly against the wood. She stood up slowly, the oversized trench coat making her look frail. She looked at Michael one last time. There was no hatred in her eyes, only a profound, devastating realization of the monster she had awakened. "You win, Michael," she whispered, her voice barely carrying across the vast room. "You kept the company." She turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the sterile space like a metronome winding down. Michael watched the doors click shut behind her, sealing her fate. He looked down at the tear-stained paper on the table. He had executed the perfect counteroffensive. He had protected his assets, annihilated his rival, and ruthlessly amputated the traitor from his ranks. He was the undisputed, solitary king of his empire. Yet as he sat entirely alone in the massive, silent boardroom, surrounded by the cold architecture of his success, the silence was deafening. He had saved Pemberton Tech, but he had sacrificed the last remnants of his own soul to do it. He closed his eyes, the memory of her betrayal forever etched into the darkest corners of his mind. "I can forgive the nights you spent in his bed, Harper," he murmured to the empty room. "But I can never forgive the days you spent in my boardroom."